Hello and welcome back to Deck Doctor. This week I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Now, I kind of already made my mind up of what I was going to do for Deck Doctor earlier on in the week, but then yesterday I played this deck I now call Guards of War. Now, one of my viewers named Sniperbait gave me a deck list that he'd been working on, and I took a look at it and I made some changes and kind of saw what I found with the strengths of the list, what the weakness is, refined it, and I ended up with this deck list which I now call Guards of War. And it changed my mind. I've decided I wanted to do a Deck Doctor on this instead because I've been really enjoying it. It's been a lot of fun and it's been very different to some of the more conventional combat decks that we're used to. Now, as you can see with the list, it does run both sets of guards, and that's where the name comes from, and it also runs the Herald of War. Now, Herald of War I kind of considered underwhelming, but in this deck list specifically, it's actually pretty good because it pushes your guards up to 4/7s, and Cappuccino was kind enough to point out to me that you can dodge Choking Sand with that power up, so that can be very important, especially if yellow is popular at your end of the ladder. So this is kind of a mid-rangey tempo-y deck that goes at one side with lots of neutrals. You can do that because you're prioritizing the guards in your opening hand, and then you eventually build mountains, and you take board control by using the ramp cards, as I like to call them. So the Ogre Dance and the Blood Song reduce the cost of stuff in hand, and if you can manage your hand really well, you can get some really good combos off, like the Ogre Dance into the Red Devil, or Ogre Dance into Garadan, or Blood Song spreading across a lot of expensive creatures, making them much cheaper. So I feel this deck could be quite strong. I'm not sure if this is going to be the final build, but I'm very comfortable with how this has played out in my testing, and I hope you guys will enjoy it too. So let's get into the cards and talk about how they bring this deck together. To start things off, we're going to take a look at the combat creatures, or at least most of them. And these are kind of the core cards of the deck. Now, Herald of War, which I kind of mentioned in the intro, is a card that I wasn't impressed with when it first came out, but I do see the value of it and this style of mid-range tempo deck where you can extend the power of your combat creatures. And this is a card you're not going to be playing in the early game. This is a card you're going to play as support to your Kings and Queens guards. Both the guards are basically your priority in your mulligan, and they will be leading the charge against your opponent. Now, Kingsguard and Queensguard, I've already just talked about time and time again how valuable Faeria generation is of combat with the underground cards, and the same applies to Queensguard. But what's great about Kingsguard is it gives you the variety of more card draw, and this allows you to get much wider spread Blood Songs, which is always really good, because if you had your Blood Songs tick in twice, say on a free cost card, you actually lose a Faeria in value there. So being able to get a wider hand for a better Blood Song is also very good. And these are the core creatures of your offense and defense, and the guards are especially good because you can play a lot of neutral lands in the early game. Now, you could say, why not just use Underground Boss and Underground Brigand? The difference is basically that you can just pump out neutrals for the first 2 turns, get a collector down, which is very sturdy, and apply enormous pressure by swinging the board with Gifter Steals or just ramping out very cheap Red Devils. So I feel that the guards actually work better than the combat creatures of red, other than the Herald, just because of the flexibility of being able to play them quicker and in a more aggressive position earlier on. These are some of the other creatures in this list. Silent Horsemaster, I think, is one of the best cards in the deck, simply because, like I said, with the guards, you develop a lot of neutrals, you apply pressure to your opponent's side of the board very quickly with lands, and this gives you a lot of flexibility with the Horsemaster because developing neutrals isn't really an issue. You only need 2 mountains for this deck to be active for its red creatures. And this means that Silent Horsemaster and the guards can have a lot of influence on the board very early on. It's very easy to side switch across your opponent's lands by developing neutrals and using their own lands against them with the guards once they reach your opponent's wells. And yeah, I think this card is amazing in general, but in this deck, I've been having fantastic results with it, maybe better than some of the other decks out there that use Silent Horsemaster. It very much reminds me of how Mid-Red has used Silent Horsemaster in the past, but because you run so many more neutral creatures, I feel that this deck utilizes it to its fullest potential. Now, Magnus is interesting. So I wasn't 100% sold on Magnus at first when I saw Sniper Bait's list, but once I started seeing how Bloodsong and the other ramp elements started to work, I kind of like this now. He's a combat creature, he's a little bit pricey, but against some matchups, he's going to be absolutely crucial. Like Mono Green, for example, just have to kind of deal with this through combat and on their terms, but because he has charge free, you can position him in a way that he can get the most value. You can at least get maybe 1 or 2 hits off, and then if it hits stuff like Red Devil or Garadan, you're getting tremendous value. And there's also a little trick with this card. I'll go into it a bit more in the land placement segment, but basically if you have Magnus in your opening hand with the Explore card, you can go +1 on your opening turn and make no land. Then on your second turn, you can go +1 again on your power wheel, so you can get 2 Faeria, play Explore in your center, and then play Magnus. And that's a turn 2 Magnus. And against some decks, they're not going to be able to deal with that. Mono Red being a good example. Now, Garadan is also in the list because it's a very powerful card, excellent against stuff like Yellow Events and Blue Jump, but it also benefits from the ramp cards in the deck, the bargain cards that are more commonly known in Faeria, but I'm not actually running Bold Bargainer in this list. And Garadan, you know, he's just a great card. You're going to be able to have synergies with Magnus, with the ramp cards, and against specific matchups, he's going to really help you swing the board in your favor. Since we were talking about ramp cards, let's take a look at them now. Bloodsong, again, another card that didn't really impress me when it got released, but after playing it in this deck, it's really strong. I'm really enjoying its inclusion because it basically just makes your hand cheaper, and with stuff like Kingsguard, being able to spread your Bloodsong across a wider hand is much more valuable than saying using a Bloodsong on 2 cards in your hand, because you may not get full value out of the cost reduction, and that's where the Kingsguard synergy is really good with this card. And another thing that this card does, which I kind of realized recently, is let's say, for example, you have a King and a Queen's Guard in hand, and you have 4 Faeria at the start of your turn. You can't collect any more Faeria because you say you don't have any creatures, but you draw a Bloodsong. Now, Bloodsong is going to allow you to play creatures that turn. So it's very good at helping you come back from behind if you have creatures in hand and you don't have a lot of Faeria, because you can generate your, say your top, as I would say, top deck in Faeria. Say you're Faeria starved, you go into your turn, you have 3 Faeria, you draw the Bloodsong, but you have a couple of creatures in hand. You can then +1 into Bloodsong, and maybe you can end up playing a Kings and Queens Guard that turn, which you wouldn't be able to do without Bloodsong's help. So fantastic inclusion. Now, Ogre Dance, I was running 3 of these originally, but I dropped them down to 2 because they can be a bit clunky. But if you have very good hand management skills, if you try and time them and maybe predict what you might draw, they can be very valuable, especially in combination with cards like Red Devil to its side. You can gain tremendous amounts of Faeria advantage. So try and time this card well. Like I said, it can be clunky if you draw, say, Bloodsong and Ogre Dance together, but maybe a little patience is required. Wait a few turns, maybe just use the Bloodsong. Wait till you draw something a bit more high valued, Red Devil, Magnus, Garadan, for example, and then you can use the Ogre Dance and get as much value as possible. Now, Red Devil, again, you know, another ramp card. You get to play it. It gives you Faeria back. It's quite pricey, but it has a very nice aggressive body. And when you play this on your opponent's wells, which I'll show you in land placement a little bit later, a Horsemaster can be incredibly deadly and allow you to push a lot of damage. And of course, you want this card to be hit by the ramp cards. You want Ogre Dance and Bloodsong to hit this because you're going to gain additional Faeria back. So just an excellent addition to this kind of pseudo ramp tempo deck that has been created. Last but not least, we have the event cards of this list. Now, finding a correct balance for event cards was interesting because I had to take into consideration that there were ramp cards like Bold Bargainer was in the original list, Ogre Dance and Bloodsong, and it's a bit awkward because when you want to play bargain decks, you want to play high cost creatures that you then reduce with your ramp cards, and that kind of evens things out. But I felt that Bloodsong doesn't really complement that style of deck. It's actually a little bit better if it's reducing lower cost cards because it allows you to develop on board and remove threats for much cheaper. So what I decided in the end was to kind of make a split between cheap damage events and high cost damage events to help close out matches. So Flame Burst, for example, just a fantastic card in general. Free Faeria, free damage wherever you wanted to go, be it a structure. So that could be pretty important when killing libraries, for example, and going to the orb if you're trying to finish off your opponent, or controlling the board. So a very flexible card, and I feel that this is just a perfect inclusion to any kind of aggressive tempo-y mid-range decks. And I felt that with Bloodsong, it could become a 1 cost or a 0 cost, so that could be very helpful. Gift of Steel, pretty obvious. We already have a lot of combat creatures in this deck. We have the Guards, we have the Herald, but we also have Magnus. So Gift of Steel was just a very obvious inclusion. But Hellfire, so now this is going to the top end of damage dealing events, and this is going to make use of the Ogre Dance. So while Flame Burst utilizes the Bloodsong, Hellfire is to utilize the Ogre Dance, and this is a great finisher, a great way to help you manage boards so you get behind, or just to solidify your winning state and finish off the game. So I feel that the event spread was very, I kind of thought about it, how I wanted to spread it out. I did a bit of testing, and I feel this is pretty good. If you guys have any other suggestions of how we can spread the events out, or maybe just the cards in general in relation to Bloodsong and Ogre Dance, by all means drop a message in the comments to me and I'll take a look. For the mulligan, you're just going to want to find a guard. They are your priority cards, Queen's Guard or King's Guard, because it really complements how we want to build land in the first 3 turns of our matches. Horsemaster's pretty good as well. You can set it up as an early collector, or you can use it for its utility if your opponent decides to try and contest you on the same side, and then you can develop a turn to Queen's Guard, for example, and then they may think they're out of range, and then you can use that Horsemaster to push up. But ideally, you want guards. I feel the guards are the best plays. You're going to be playing them turn 2. You're going to be playing them pretty close to your opponent's well, because you're going to double neutral twice to start things off, unless you're on Explore, but again, I'll cover that in land placement. So yeah, very easy. Other cards you could consider is Flame Burst, bit removal, but you're not going to be developing mountains until either turn 3 or 4, so that's something to consider. And another thing to consider is Gift of Steel as well, to increase the power of your guards. And Herald of War is not too bad as well, but again, we're developing a lot of neutral. So Kings and Queens Guard are 100% what you want to keep. What you decide to keep after that, you can base around maybe getting a Gift of Steel for one of the guards, maybe getting a Flame Burst to kill a Water Elemental or something that's going to collect, or maybe just getting that Herald ready to provide support for your future guard cards. Now you know about the deck, you're probably wondering how much this deck costs, and it costs 1,155 Memoria with 11 commons, 15 rares, 2 epics, and 2 legendaries. So already you can see that the legendaries make up the prime amount of Memoria you're going to need to craft this deck. Half of it is paid for through rares, commons, and epics, whereas probably the other half is covered through legendaries. So there are ways you can make this a budget variant. Now, Garadan is probably a card I'd want to keep 100%. But there are alternatives you can use. Magnus, it's kind of up to you. I've been enjoying Magnus, but I don't think he is crucial. I feel like there could be other cards you can experiment with in that slot. So if you don't own Magnus, again, you can find a replacement. So I was thinking about some of the changes you could make, and one that came to mind was adding the Cobbled Warlord. It's a combat creature. It's a pricey one that's going to be have a good cost reduction from the Ogre Dance, and it can empower your other creatures on board. Now, I actually believe Cobbled Warlord might be a better card than Magnus in this style of deck, but I'm going to have to do a bit of testing myself. So if you guys do decide to try out the Cobbled Warlord instead of Magnus, by all means, give me let me know in the comments and tell me what you think of that change. Another obvious change, I think, is dropping the Garadan for a Firestorm. Now, Firestorm's only an epic, whereas Garadan's a legendary. Now, you will miss the 6/6 awesomeness of Garadan flying and charging around the board, but until you can afford that, I think Firestorm is a very good replacement. Firestorm is very handy when trying to get board control back, and I've been using it a lot in Crackthorn recently, and I value the card greatly. I maybe would have put a Firestorm and a Garadan in this list, but I didn't have any room, and it would mean I'd have to build up the 3 mountains, which I don't really want to do if I can avoid it. So Garadan obviously has the land requirement fit for the deck list, whereas Firestorm, it's just a good cheap alternative if you can't afford the legendaries right now. Let's take a look at the strengths and weaknesses. This deck is still in its infancy. It only came into being about a day ago, so there's going to be things about this deck we don't know yet, and this list I've given you is probably not the complete refined version. There's probably a lot of things that can be done to it to make it more consistent, make it stronger, but we'll discover that as we play it for the next couple of weeks. Now, this deck has great land development. You develop a lot of neutrals for your kings and queens guards, which allow you to take your control of your opponent's wells very quickly. And I was just thinking that Axe Grind is probably a good inclusion for a deck that does this. So that's another thing we could include to make the game plan more consistent. Yeah, faster land development is a great strength. You develop a lot of neutrals, and as I said earlier, the Silent Horsemaster benefits from this greatly. Resource generation from combat. So Kings and Queens Guard, one of their beauties is that they give you resources back when your opponent tries to remove them by combat. So for example, the King's Guard gives you card draw, and the more cards you have in hand, the better your blood songs become. Queen's Guard gives you Faeria. The more Faeria you have, the more likely you're going to be able to play your high cost cards like Magnus and Garadan. So these two cards synergize great with the ramp cards, but also the more expensive cards in the list. It also, like I said, has strong ramp plays with Bloodsong and Ogre Dance. So if you're able to hit a Bloodsong on a bunch of creatures in your hand, you can make a massive board swing from that, which is very different to how traditional bargain decks go about it. I actually feel that this Bloodsong variant has a much better way to influence the board with masses rather than just playing one big guy like traditional bargain decks. So that's really cool. And another thing about Bloodsong which I came to realize is it's a good top deck as long as you have creatures in hand. If you're behind on Faeria and you draw a, say you're Faeria starved, at the start of your turn you generate 3 Faeria, you have say a King's and a Queen's Guard in hand, and then you draw a Bloodsong. Now, in any normal situation you'd have to wait a turn to play either of those guards, but because of the Bloodsong draw, you can +1 into Bloodsong, and then you could potentially play one of the guards, and that will be very valuable in those situations. And Ogre Dance, which I talked about earlier, hitting stuff like Red Devil, Garadan, just hitting a guard is really good. It's going to allow you to play them at a much cheaper cost. And yeah, and it's the ramp tools I think are very strong, considering this is a more aggressive deck than traditional bargain decks. Now, as for the weaknesses, no hard removal, just kind of a common problem for red, but that just means that green creatures can be a big problem, especially if they get empowered and they apply a lot of pressure to your orb. There are limited event removal, and it's not just restricted to events actually. We don't run Ground Shakers, Bomb Slingers, Scyther's Wrath, Firestorm. You know, all this conventional red stuff we're used to seeing, I haven't put in here because I don't have room, for one. And two, I don't think we need it all. I feel that board play is in our favor thanks to the efficiency and the resource generation of the guard cards. Ogre Dance and Bloodsong can be awkward depending on your hand. Yeah, that's pretty much explains everything. So let's say you have 2 Bloodsongs in hand, an Ogre Dance and a Magnus. It's a bit awkward. You can get around it sometimes if you're a little patient and maybe time your cards correctly through a couple of turns. You can do a bit of damage control, but I feel like it takes a bit of practice and a bit of knowing on what you might be able to draw and make a bit of predictions. Like if I draw a Red Devil now and then I Bloodsong into a 0-cost Ogre Dance and hit Red Devil, it's going to be good value. So it'll take a bit of deck knowledge before you can kind of overcome that problem more consistently, but it can be an issue, so keep that in mind. To finish things off, we will talk about land placement. Very simple. You want to develop neutral tiles up towards your opponent's well, contest and fight at your opponent's well, and eventually push damage to finish the game. Now, depending on what turn you play will depend on how you develop your land. So if you're playing first, you don't have access to explore. So what you're going to want to do is double neutral, play a guard or a horsemaster, then play your first mountain, and that is your ideal setup for your first 3 turns of land development. Now, if you have explore, you can play a little differently. You can go double neutral, explore, mountain, play a Queen's or King's Guard, and then mountain again, and that gives you all the mountains you need for the rest of the game. You're gonna have to develop one more mountain if you are going first, but I always feel when I go second with this deck, it feels so much better because I can get my mountains out quicker, which means that I can get my Gift of Steels and my Flame Burst and my Heralds down faster and have more influence on the board. Now, there was a comment on the forums because I posted this deck up on the hub, and they were saying they were struggling against Rush. Now, I feel this deck has a very good matchup against Rush, simply because you develop a lot of neutral lands, and this will allow you to lock your opponent into one avenue of attack very easily. And I've posted here an example of how you could develop your lands when defending against Rush. And you're going to have all these great taunters like the Queen's Guard and the King's Guard, and your opponent is going to have to hit into them or remove them with events. Or you're going to gain tremendous amounts of value. And once you stabilize, once your opponent stops for a turn, maybe you've just starved them of Faeria, you start developing neutrals at the side like you would in a normal game, and eventually start pushing damage, and then you have the Hellfire to help finish off the game. So I actually feel this has a good matchup against Rush, and this might actually be a good pick because you have the flexibility from playing an aggressive playstyle when you're not playing against Rush, and then playing that more defensive playstyle against Rush, making full use of the guard cards. That wraps up this episode of Deck Doctor. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I have been loving this deck ever since I made it with Sniper Bait, and it's just so fun. It's my style of deck, to be honest. This is what I love to play in card games, these very tempo aggressive style decks, but I just love the use of the Queen's Guards and the King's Guards with the Horsemaster. It's really fun. I'm a fan of these kind of neutral style of builds, but one thing that I really like about this is it's quite different for a red deck. We're not running all the conventional red cards, we're trying new things out, and it's this type of exploration that really cracks open archetypes and develops new decks. For Faeria, we saw it with the zoo style decks, which I covered in one of the card spotlight. I feel that deck has a lot of potential going into the future when it gets more cards, and hopefully this deck will do the same. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you do like it, be sure to give it a thumbs up. I greatly appreciate it. And of course, if you haven't already, drop a subscribe where you can keep up to date of when this content goes live. And man, we're going to have a lot of content for you in the future. If you haven't already, check out faeria.com/the-hub for all the latest articles, decks and guides from the community and myself. So until next time guys, take care and enjoy Gods of War.